Okay, grade 11. This is our last screencast lesson for SL students. HL students will have one more a lab you have to do, and I'll do a short screencast on how to use the lab simulation software. But this is our last full lesson. This is the end of 4.4. We've been working a lot on this subtopic, and we're going to look at some climate change data now and really try to bring all the skills from 4.3 and 4.4 together. So here's the different applications from 4.3 and 4.4 we're going to focus on today. So we're evaluating claims that human activities are not causing climate change, correlations between global temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations on Earth, application, threats to coral reefs from increasing concentrations of dissolved carbon dioxide, which you've been analyzing already with the assignment, and analysis of data from air monitoring stations to explain annual fluctuations. So let's start with coral bleaching because that's something you've been analyzing data for already. And I'm not going to spend time on the data of this because you've already looked at that, but I want to just reinforce and clarify what's happening in terms of the biology of the corals themselves. So of course, coral bleaching is when you have a coral that goes from being, this is a staghorn coral, from being healthy and colorful and full of algae to looking like this. Okay, that's a bleached coral. So what's happening is in a coral normally, it's a symbiotic relationship between the little algae, which are called zooxanthellae, and they live inside the coral. So the coral is an animal and the zooxanthellae are a protist, they're an algae, and they live together in a symbiotic relationship. Both get something out of it. So the algae are going to get a safe place to live, they're going to get nutrients, filtered out from the water from the coral, and the coral will get the sugars produced by the algae when they photosynthesize. So both together get something in a relationship. It's a symbiotic relationship. But when the temperature gets too hot, it causes the physiology of the zooxanthellae to change, and they emit products that are dangerous to the coral. So the coral will expel them, and then they are released from the coral, and the coral no longer has zooxanthellae. And while corals, they can survive for a little while like this without any zooxanthellae in them, they're very vulnerable and they can't survive forever. So if the temperature goes back down or things go back to normal and then the zooxanthellae can then come back in the coral, then it will come back to life and it's fine. And we're seeing some parts of reefs in the world where they have this healing is starting to happen, which is wonderful to see. Another consequence of global warming is we have temperatures rising, and as temperatures rise, of course, we're going to increase ocean acidity because CO2 dissolving in the water makes it acidic. And then it's going to start to break down the coral. So the coral, once it's been bleached, it can then be broken down by more of the acidic water. So we have both a higher temperature and the pH change, both affecting the coral and the shells. So it's not only coral that can be broken down, but other shells of organisms, clams, other kinds of bivalves, scallops, mussels, all those things, their shells can be broken down, snails, by the slightly acidic pH of the water. And remember, when you have CO2 entering water, it can become carbonic acid, and therefore can be low pH and break things down. So it's dangerous for not just coral, but any kind of shellfish living in the ocean, which of course would have devastating effects on the ecosystem as a whole. Okay, so here's a nice little summary diagram of this from NOAA, from the American Ocean and Atmospheric Science Association. And if you look here, we have the different coral, our normal healthy coral, we have algae, zooxanthellae living inside the coral branches, and everyone's surviving, everyone's happy. It's a symbiotic relationship. When the coral becomes stressed, the algae are going to be kicked out, they're going to leave the coral, the zooxanthellae, and then this can be caused by increased ocean temperature, also pollution can also cause it to happen. And then we have this bleached and vulnerable coral. Now this coral, remember, is not dead yet, but if it loses its zooxanthellae for a long period of time, it can die. It can get sick, disease can attack it, it's going to be a lot less energy efficient, and it will most likely not survive if the zooxanthellae don't come back quickly enough. Okay, so that's coral bleaching. The science behind it, you already know about the patterns of it from your assignment. Okay, let's look at some other data here. So other data you need to understand and be able to look at is CO2 data and temperature data. So here is a graph showing the parts per million of carbon dioxide over time, And this is from Mauna Loa Observatory. This is in Hawaii. It's a very famous observatory from NOAA again that gives very good data, and they're constantly collecting carbon dioxide temperature, a whole bunch of different atmospheric data. And here we have all these numbers here. So you notice there's two lines. We have this red line going up and down. So in 1 year, it goes up and down. And then the black line is kind of showing the mean change over time from 1960 to 2020. They're modeling it from about 300, less than 320, 318 parts per million up to 410 parts per million or so. So if you look at this, you have to really understand what this is showing in terms of this little line going up and down. So I want you to pause the video and think about, why would this CO2 data go up and down? It goes up and down every year. Why would that happen? Well, a really important thing to remember is that seasons are going to very strongly affect some major parts of the carbon cycle. So in North America, which is where we have most of the land mass of the world, we have very strong seasonal changes, whereas in fall and winter, we have very few plants photosynthesizing because they've lost all their leaves, and in spring, we have a large amount. So if we have more photosynthesis happening, those plants can be taking in that carbon dioxide. So you see the levels decrease in the spring and summer, and they increase again in the winter, which is why we have to look at this mean line, because this is an increase-decrease from the seasonal change of amount of plants. Now, if those plants were there all the time, and there wasn't seasonal change, then it would be the lower point here would be our curve. But that's not the case, right? They go away in the fall, are gone in winter, and come back in the spring. And unfortunately, most of the land mass of our planet is up in the northern hemisphere, so we have a lot of CO2 difference happening here. This is a huge impact on the global carbon cycle. Okay, here's another graph. This one is just showing temperature. So it's temperature anomalies here. An anomaly means how much has changed above or below the historical data. Okay, so you'll notice here again, there's two graphs. There's the two lines. We have an annual mean, and we have what's called the lowest smoothing. Let's take a look at that and kind of see what patterns do you notice here. And why does this data fluctuate? Why does it change? Well, the annual mean, this is a temperature they're trying to do it for an entire year. So these are the means for the entire year. And it's going to vary greatly over the entire planet. So we have to have this kind of smoothing line. We're going to take into account the changes to kind of give a more accurate global pattern, because this up and down is a normal kind of function of climate on Earth. Climate is actually very complicated, and it's going to change a little bit year to year. So the annual mean is going to change a little bit, and that's normal, but the red line is calculated to help us get this smooth. It's a 5-year lowest smoothing. So down the bottom here, it's a 5-year lowest smooth. They're taking the mean over those 5 years and using that to make that line, to give you a better idea to clearly see the pattern in the data. You notice here a few of these points have error bars. Okay, and the reason why they have that is because there's insufficient data for those years to have a clear data point, and they've wanted to show the error bars for those ones because there's some standard deviation. This one's particularly high because insufficient data taken in 1886. Okay, so they're 95% certainty, those blue error bars, and that's because they have incomplete spatial sampling, so incomplete sampling over the entire Earth. So when you're looking at these kinds of graphs, you need to make sure you really understand what they're showing and take a minute to really think about what they're showing you and what it means. Read the descriptions and make sure when you're making graphs, you give more detailed descriptions like this. And really think of what's the best way to communicate the data and what is data showing you. So on your test, it's going to be done this way. You're going to have to analyze data and look at things. So you should take a minute and really look at the graphs and think about what they're telling you. Look at the axes, look at the key, look at the trends before you start just answering questions. Okay, let's talk about proxy data. So, first of all, proxy data is data that is not from the moment that it's happening, it's data from the past. And we need proxy data for climate change to figure out things like carbon dioxide levels. Why do we need that? Why can't we just use data from right now? Well, climate change is a long-term process over many, many hundreds and thousands and millions of years. And if we just use data, since we've been collecting atmospheric samples, which would be, 50, 60 years, that's not a long enough time to really see any long-term patterns. So we have to use proxy data to get an idea of the climate pattern changes over a longer period of time. So we do that with ice cores. This is an actual ice core. I think this one's from Antarctica, and you'll see the lines here. These are showing different years. So you can see the patterns in the darkness and lightness and the different thicknesses of the sections of the ice. They're scientists that they study and they're experts in ice cores. So we already talked about ice cores a little bit in the previous lesson. Can you remember what can we learn from ice cores? What information can they tell us? Well, if you look here, you can see little dots. There's going to be air bubbles frozen inside the ice, and those contain samples of air from that time period. So we can figure out how much carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases was in the atmosphere at that time, the little time capsule ice bubble. We can also figure out how long the season was, how hot or cold it was, based on how thick the line is. It shows you the snow melt. The darker it is more clear. It's going to be more melted, and whiter is more snowpack. So they can analyze the climate backwards from that. And these ice cores in regions like Antarctica and the Arctic can go very, very deep, and they can get tens of thousands of years of data, which is wonderful because to understand climate change, we have to have long-term data. It's too complicated, there's too many variables that we don't understand, and we need to have really good data to help us understand what's happening because it's a huge problem for the entire planet. So here's a graph we looked at earlier, and if you remember here, there was the data here from Mauna Loa, the Hawaiian data collection, and here we have the green line, that's from the Laudoma, Antarctica. So this is ice core data mixed with current sampling data. So it's showing you the CO2 level matched up with the global temperature anomaly. So temperature is changing, and the important idea here is that we have this connection between the increase in CO2 level and the correlation between that and the correlation between the global temperature anomaly. So temperature is increasing as CO2 also increases. Okay, so people who talk about climate change, it's a very political thing, depending on which country of the world you're in. You may have a lot of climate change deniers or less, but both climate change deniers and climate scientists both rely on data. And they rely on data to support their arguments, and they show you a graph, they talk about numbers, and it's to help them convince their point and clarify what they're trying to say, what they mean. So the key here is that scientists will use the entire data set. Okay, and they are held accountable in a way that politicians and just spokespeople are not held accountable by the peer review process. So when a scientist publishes a journal, before it can be published, it's sent to several other experts in that field, and they verify that what they're saying looks correct, it fits with the data. They make sure that their experiment was well done, there's not too many sources of error, there's good constants, all that kind of stuff. That they're not manipulating the statistics, and that's peer reviewed before it's even published. And then once it's published, many other scientists will read that information, and if they're in the same field especially, they will then do comparative studies, they will further new studies based on what they found, the previous one, and they'll just continue to develop the knowledge about that topic. So scientists are constantly kind of checking on each other and making sure that what they're being said is true. And the nature of science is that we never say anything is ever 100% true or proven. That we never say our hypothesis is correct, our hypothesis is proven. We always say it's supported because we're never 100% sure. We're always looking for more information to clarify. And as soon as you find information that disproves your hypothesis, then you change it. And you look for the data. Was there a source of error? You're always trying to find the answer, but never ignoring data. So in science, we can never take an outlier in your data and experiment. You can't just take it out. That's a lie. You have to keep the outlier there and either find out what caused it, what's happening, and do new trials, see if it's what's causing the outlier, and then try to rectify that. Get some more data so the outlier doesn't affect the mean too much, that kind of stuff. Whereas politicians and some climate change deniers, those who are trying to manipulate the data, they're not held to this standard. They don't have a whole group of people in the same field who are experts saying, show this, don't show that. this is true, that's not true, this is supported by my experiment as well. They don't have that kind of accountability. So what they will do sometimes is they will choose which data to discuss. And they'll take a graph like this, and they'll just zoom in on one part of it and say, oh, look, it's not changing very much right here. And they'll just focus on some part of it, and so the entire graph and its entirety show all the changes. Okay, so this is zooming in on the previous graph just from 2014 to 2019. And I want you now to answer these 4 analysis questions because answering questions about data is part of the skill set for this unit. Okay, so it's 4 questions. Estimate the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide in January 2014, October 2017 using the corrected values, which is the NOAA data, which is the black line is the corrected values. Examine the highest and lowest point in the red line, determine in which month this point most often occurs. In terms of sun respiration and photosynthesis rates, in the northern hemisphere, explain the yearly downward fluctuations from May to October and the yearly upward fluctuations from October to May. And number 4, what is the overall trend in this data set? Cite specific data points and the percent change to support your conclusions. So you need to do a percent change calculation. Okay, answer these 4 questions in your notes, and when you upload to Schoology, I'll give you feedback on how you did. Okay, now it's really important that you guys practice looking at different evidence critically, not just for this unit and this course, but just to be well-educated adults who can make your own decisions in the world. There's going to get a lot of information to be sent at you, and as we have internet, social media, it's getting to be really crazy. I know whenever elections happen in my country, I have to read a ton of sources of things before I feel like I can make an informed decision, because people communicate information in a very controlled and precise way to try and get their point across. And if I don't necessarily agree with their point, I need to see other sources to compare it with. I really like this cartoon. It really kind of points this fact here, that a lot of times skeptics, climate change deniers, people who are just looking for a reason not to change our habits in the world will look for any small fault in the data or any small pattern that something is happening and ignore the majority of the data. So you're going to do a little assignment. It has about your own perspective about climate change and about your ability to analyze data for reliability. And you're going to analyze 5 different claims about climate change from actual news sources. So this is something you need to upload it as well to Schoology. I'm not going to judge you based on your opinions about climate change and what you are correct or incorrect. This is more about an activity of practicing this skill of looking at data. Have you learned enough to be able to make decisions about it? Can you analyze things clearly? Do you have any biases you weren't aware of? Again, I'm not going to be grading this. I'm going to be checking for completion and checking for understanding and see if you need any support before the test next week about how to analyze these kinds of sources. Okay, so this is what that assignment looks like. Okay, so this is the assignment. I'll post it for you guys on Schoology, of course, and you're going to talk about different claims, possible scientific claims, and say where you are in this, like good self-diagnosis. 2, 3, a bunch of different claims here. Then you're going to talk about how you're going to analyze climate change articles. And then we have 5 articles you'd actually evaluate. There's kind of a summary of them. So very short, here's the thing, and then evaluate it. And then a second one, evaluate it. And these are all actual articles. Third one, evaluate it. Fourth one, and then a 5th one. Okay, that's your second part of today's lesson's task. And this will be due by the end of the week. So for SL students, that is the end of this unit. It's your last task. I will try and get your review stuff up for you guys later this week or not over the weekend. And I'll schedule your test. You'll have a test sign up on Zoom for Wednesday and Thursday next week. All right, guys, I hope this is helpful for you. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to ask me. I hope you have questions for our Zoom this week to talk about things and clarify any misunderstandings you may have about this unit. Have a good day.